Dr. Seuss, The Great Doodler by Katie Klimo, paintings by Steve Johnson and Lou Fancher. It is a beautiful day in La Jolla, California. A writer and artist is at work in his studio. The telephone rings. A reporter is calling with big news. The writer has won a big award for his books. It is the Pulitzer Prize. The writer is Ted Geisel, also known as Dr. Seuss. Ted nearly falls off his chair. Is this a joke? Ted loves playing jokes and pranks, but he takes his work seriously. Now the world is doing so too. Not bad for a lifelong doodler. Theodore Ted Seuss Geisel was born on March 2, 1904 in Springfield, Massachusetts. His mother's name was Henrietta Seuss Geisel. She read to him and his big sister Marnie. She also sang chants. She once used to sell pies in her parents' shop. He later got his love of wordplay and reading from his mother. Thanks to his father, Theodore, Ted became interested in machines. His father tinkered in his shop, making wacky inventions. One of them was a machine that made arm muscles stronger. From an early age, Ted liked to doodle. He always had a pencil and a pad at hand. Near his house was a zoo. Lying in bed at night, he could hear the lions roaring and the elephants trumpeting. During the day, he would go there and doodle pictures of animals. Marnie said his animals never looked quite like the real ones. Ted had a happy childhood until World War I broke out. The Geisels were German American. Many Americans blamed the war on Germany. Kids bullied Ted. He wanted to prove that he was a true American. So he joined the Boy Scouts and sold war bonds. He was one of the top 10 bond sellers. Former President Theodore Roosevelt came to honor the 10 Scouts. But there was a mix-up and no medal for Ted. He was so embarrassed. Ever since that day, he had stage fright. After high school, Ted went to Dartmouth College. He worked on the humor magazine. He drew zany-looking animals with zany names. A bulkov was a creature with an umbrella tail. Sometimes he signed the drawings with his middle name, Seuss. Ted went on to study at Oxford University in England. He was bored by long classes, so he doodled. A fellow American student saw him doodling. "Oh, that's a very fine flying cow," said Helen Palmer. "You ought to be an artist." Ted and Helen rode around together on a motorcycle. Ted wanted to marry Helen, but how would he earn a living? Back in Springfield, Ted drew tons of cartoons. He sent them to magazines, signed Dr. Theophilus Seuss. A magazine called the Saturday Evening Post bought some of his cartoons. Ted also got a job at a different magazine. Now he could marry Helen. They moved into an apartment in New York City. He kept on doodling. Ted drew a clever cartoon about a bug spray called Flit. The bug spray company loved it and gave him more work. He became an ad man. As he did when he was a kid, he made up zany critters, this time for ads. Years later, zany fish like these would fill his book, McElligot's Pool. Ted wanted to do more with his doodling. A trip by ocean liner inspired him. The ship's engine droned, dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum. He had started to write to the rhythm of the engine. He wrote a story about the crazy things a boy sees on his way to and from school. When he sent it around town, 27 publishers turned it down. Then he ran into a friend who had just become a children's book editor. Mick McClintock loved his book. The title was, "And to Think That I Saw It on Merleberry Street." It was Dr. Seuss's very first book. Dr. Seuss went on to publish new children's books at a steady rate for the rest of his life. Some of them won awards. Horton Hatches the Eggs was a big hit in 1940. The story was silly, but it had a deep message. People loved the elephant who said, "I meant what I said and I said what I meant. An elephant's faithful 100%. Ted did not publish a children's book during World War II. Lots of Americans wanted the United States to stay out of war. But Ted wasn't one of them. He drew cartoons that poked fun at Hitler and Japan. They urged America to fight for what was right. America finally entered the war. Ted joined the army. He worked with a team of filmmakers in Hollywood. They made funny training cartoons starring a soldier who couldn't do anything right. Army pals like Chuck Jones and P.D. Eastman would work with Ted in years to come. After the war, Ted and Helen stayed in California. In 1947, Ted found an old, unused fire tower in La Jolla. He and Helen fell in love with it. They bought the tower and made it their home. Ted's studio was in the tower. He kept a hat rack there filled with wacky hats, a fireman's hat from Ecuador, a Turkish fez, and an admiral's hats from around the world. Sometimes when he was having trouble with the story, he would put on a silly hat. Ted wanted each book to be perfect. He wrote and he rewrote. He read aloud to Helen. He sketched and resketched. He pinned his sketches to a corkboard. He worked until the words and pictures were just right. Then he took his book to New York City. In his publisher's office, he would read it aloud. Workers would crowd around to listen to Ted's latest story. In 1955, Life magazine ran an article that said most early reading books were boring. The job of writing books for early readers should go to artists like Dr. Seuss and Walt Disney. Ted was dared to write a book using 225 simple words. He thought he could write the book in 2 weeks. It took him more than a year. The Cat in the Hat was published in 1957. The book sold like hotcakes. It changed the way children learned how to read. How the Grinch Stole Christmas also came out in 1957. Someone once said that the cat was Ted on a good day and the Grinch was Ted on a bad day. Ted felt he was more like the gruff and grumpy character. His car license plate even said Grinch. 8 years later, Ted worked with Chuck Jones to make an animated special based on How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Both the show and the book became Christmas classics. In 1958, Ted became president of Beginner Books. He would publish a line of easy-to-read books like Cat in the Hat. The office was like a fun house. Ted wrote some of the readers. His wife, Helen, wrote some too. He hired friends to do others. Mike McClintock wrote A Fly Went By. P.D. Eastman wrote Go Dog Go. Ted published Stan and Jan Berenstein's first book about the Berenstain Bears. Everything Ted touched turned into a bestseller. Then, in 1967, a terrible thing happened. Helen died. Ted was lonely and lost. A year later, he married Audrey Stone Diamond. She had a good eye. She wanted Ted to use more color in his books. Ted's works became more colorful. Audrey came to live with Ted in the tower. From there, he saw how much construction was taking place. Trees came down and buildings went up. So he started doodling about it. He wrote The Lorax. It is the story of a little creature who speaks for the trees. He tries to save them from the greedy Onceler. The story carried a powerful message about our environment. Another book with a powerful message was The Butter Battle Book. It tells about the Ukes and the Zooks. Their two armies are fighting over which side of their bread to butter. The fight is silly, but the weapons are serious. Will deadly bombs be dropped? The story never says. Some people felt the book was too scary for children, but Ted knew kids could handle it. He felt his message about the madness of nuclear war was important. Ted was now world famous. For some years, he had been sick with cancer, but there was one more book he needed to write. It was a book of advice about life's ups and downs called Oh, the Places You'll Go. So be sure when you step with care and great tact, and remember that life's a great balancing act. And will you succeed? Yes, you will indeed. 98.75% guaranteed. Kid, you'll move mountains. In a way, these were Ted's parting words. He died on September 24th, 1991. He left behind 44 books that have brought millions of children a great deal of joy. Every spring on Ted's birthday, people get together. They wear the striped cat hat, and they celebrate the words, the pictures, and the spirit of Dr. Seuss, the great Doodler.